So welcome everybody. This is a nice slower pace during the week, I think, with exhibitions and study and tutorials and groups, and it's exactly what I think is important about the caucus as well. These moments of much more intense discussion, as well as these big public moments at the weekends. We're super grateful that Rachel O'Reilly has agreed to be part of this, not only because she's a really important thinker, poet, researcher, curator and educator whose work bridges art, situated cultural politics, media philosophy and political economy, but also because she is a close relation. She's working with us and working with you, I think, in the DAI, and she's also very much, for me, an important thinker and somebody we're really glad to be in discussion with. On many levels, but also specifically because we're developing a project next year called Frontier Imaginaries. And I think this is with Vivian Zaherl and many other people who have been here last weekend and will be here on Sunday as well. But I think Vivian also has specifically invited Rachel because she feels like she's a key thinker and a very exciting thinker in relation to how this might develop. So for us, it's just a pleasure and an honour to have somebody with such wonderful and precise thinking giving us some time and some moments to hear what she has to say. Specifically entitled, this talk is entitled Practice Against the Persistence of the Mercantile. So thank you, Rachel.
Okay, I'll just start. I wanted to say, however, before I started, that I'm happy to be part of this next caucus because the previous caucus, Becoming Dutch, was quite important to my research. When I arrived in Holland, and I was thinking through the neoliberalisation of the museum back in Australia, but also through Dutch contemporary art. So I've written previously about some of the artists that have come through this space, and I've really enjoyed the difference of the vanabbe's approach to museum work in the last 10 years. So, I'm going to begin here. When the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius famously figured the Mercantile era, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Mercantile era, a setup of the division of land and sea that has lasted to this day as form, he was called upon by the Dutch East India Company to assess the capture of a Portuguese carrack, which is a ship, by a Dutch vessel at the mouth of a river in a region that Portugal claimed to be within its sovereign control. In 1609, Grotius's ruling cum treatise was published anonymously as Mare Liberum, or Free Sea, from which we inherit the idea that the sea cannot be the property or control of any particular power. Grotius argued that both laws of nature and laws of European nations, made the sea necessary to be held as commonly available to all. The physical properties of the ocean, however, he conceived of as less as any common actual material resource than as an ephemeral and ceaseless changing elementary medium, more physically similar to air than to land. Distinct from this idea of the oceanic, land was solid and given an ease of divisibility, in his words, and thus an ease of subjection to ownership, while air and sea were diffuse and could not be easily possessed. The sea could be a place of conflicting claims, but the ships were assumed to be on their way. Vessels flew under particular national flags to represent the sovereign powers that backed them. Ships could not mark possession on their own, but in Lauren Benton's innovative reading of Mare Liberum, moving vessels are marked by Mare Liberum to be fractal forms which, in their very movement and temporality, could signal jurisdiction and control, specifically in their right to protect subjects and goods. How does this legacy format of law speak to us today, especially since its spirit remains more or less installed in the United Nations rulings on the governance of the sea? Mare Liberum's assertion that the oceans were incapable of appropriation set up an oceanic comportment to modernist imagination, not just as a forgotten space, in Alan Sekula's words, of work and industry, and Sekula, I always try to point out, was of course a settler colonial artist, but a standardisation of the spirit of navigation where northern style capture is taken as always already global. Slavery can haunt this, non-Western workers can turn up to it indentured, but rarely can actively Indigenous or non-Western navigators materialise epistemo-politically and historically, as long as the oceanic infrastructure remains a space of innocent passage, that's Grotius's words, and history-resistant matter, complementary to invasion through capitalist norms of mediumistic neutrality. These north-south formattings of Enlightenment law and reason and the colonial history of property continue to impact what comes to counts as politics, ethics and knowledge in the global field, whether we are thinking inside or outside of the university, art spaces, or etc. on history, community and culture. My talk here takes material from two larger projects. One is on artistic autonomy in the settler colony, where I unpack this quote a lot more, and the other is on, obviously, my project called The Gas Imaginary, which is looking at the difference between forms and norms of modernist extractive industry investments versus contemporary unconventional mining projects, which continue through similar forces of dispossessive and racial logics that we inherit slightly twisted from modernist templates of production, labour, contract and exchange. Kant's critique of judgment articulated, and this is a pithy summary of Kant, but I think it needs to be in here, articulated a certain ethical peak of Enlightenment reason through the productive distanciation of free-playing faculties, directed away from the commands of church and state. As we can see in this illuminating quote that Gayatri Spivak picks out of this text, such reason inaugurates a freedom that can also come to be instrumental in the last instance. That is, insofar as it forms in the Northern Hemisphere a universal subject that is fully appropriate to the bourgeois era. Kantian autonomy, as my colleague at the DIE, Marina Vishman, has also argued, retains a purpose precisely in its purposelessness. The bourgeois subject is able to freely choose to attend or not to those ghosted from modernist values of development and progress and deemed to be sitting outside of that subject position. Kant writes, in a moment when philosophy is becoming conscious of the existential dimensions of governance associated with the violence of colonisation and conquest in the South. Aboriginal peoples often feature like this entangled in European texts as limit point cases studies of human value through otherness. Indeed, it is quite easy to argue that modern philosophy, Australian Indigenous peoples specifically and their cultural practices appear like this as speculative fragments inside of the key texts of Hegel, Karl Marx, Freud, Durkheim, Mauss, Engels, Mosca, Radcliffe Brown, Ruth Benedict, Talcott Parsons, Claude Levi-Strauss and Clifford Geertz and many more, in textual efforts that classify categories of humanity, duty and organisation, never engage Indigenous subjectivities or history, and mostly only ever present clues to a lost in crisis sociality on the European side. Modern philosophy itself, in other words, is an archive of race creation, difference management and power naturalisation, informing ideas of common humanity, justice, asymmetrical law and order that can be made to be entirely consistent with genocide. So I became more and more invested in researching the persistence of colonial legal history in the wake of the global financial crisis when the Australian mining boom was in full swing, and especially when a particular cluster of gas fracking companies were being installed in the harbour of my hometown port city, where 4 generations of my family grew up. This picture is a picture of existing mining licenses and exploratory mining licenses across Australia. The red is coal exploration and mining titles, the pink is coal application and releases, the blue is petroleum exploration and production titles, and the greeny colour is petroleum applications and releases. Obviously not all those projects are going to happen, but this is the extent to which the country has been scoped up for potential extraction. So at this time, around 2008, the Santos Gas Company was one of the 4 companies that had been awarded these licenses. It had commissioned a Dutch dredging company to develop to dredge World Heritage listed land and island foreshores in the harbour of Gladstone, which borders the Great Barrier Reef, as well as the license to reclaim unprecedented amounts of land to make way for a new plant of gas processing, key to the expansion of the fracking boom in my state. So this is the first time fracking comes to Australia, and it's being installed through a particular export hub on the harbour. The image on the left shows the exhibition that was opened at the same time as the museum that I was working at for 4 years came to be sponsored by the gas industry that was ruining the harbour of my hometown. And you can see how it couples post-production through Warhol with a certain fantasy of post-production in the gas company itself. I wasn't actually working at the museum at the time, but it almost coincided with my departure, which looked quite funny. There's a long personal story which I've told before, which I will skip. But it was genuinely known by those living in the affected area around the installation project, who were watching the pipes arrive before the project had been approved for production, that the approvals process for the gas infrastructure was going to be in some way proven to be problematic. It's since been put through state and federal government inquiries, and it was slated as a degree of constitutional innovation comparative to a court of the Star Chamber in the British system. I need to find out more about what that insult actually means. At the time, there was no publicly available independent water monitoring to assert pre-contamination baselines on water quality, since the peak of public monitoring happened in the 70s and 80s. And this city exists upon layers and layers of industry. A 6-month moratorium was placed on the fishing industry after millions of fish died from the dredging before a single gas well was fracked. And Aaron Brockovich was flown over to defend the fishing industry, but not the harbour ecology. Le Monde Diplomatique wrote an essay comparing the city to a Chinese special economic zone. Bill McKibben did a flyover. The Dan Rather US investigative cable show flew in to talk to the only full-time activist in town, whose name is Cheryl Watson, who owns property near where the installation was happening, so it was critiqued by the locals for having property interests in the activism. And meanwhile, the Australian media was generally silent. So I'm travelling to this location, and a lot of the information that is known but not published basically eradicates the difference between politics and gossip at this time. So this is the contemporary that I'm looking at. The police cars, actually on the bottom right-hand side, are advertising the Santos Gas Company in the same locations where they're criminalising protest against the fracking industry and taking people to jail who are resisting against it in those cars. It's actually the only... I searched for this degree of police car advertising, and even in the States, in quite poor cities, the extent of advertising is much minimal and smaller compared to what is going on here. More minimal, sorry. Do I need to explain how fracking works?
Yes.
Okay. So the most simple description of, so in Australia they called it unconventional coal seam gas because they didn't want it to be associated with the fracking industry that had already been installed in the States and was starting to, the negative information about the industry was starting to become public. But it's the same thing. So it basically enables fossil fuel companies to capture, and it's called unconventional just because it's a new method to pull out certain kinds of resources that were just unavailable or too expensive in previous technologies of production. So sometimes it's exactly the same substance, but it's just a certain technology has been tweaked, which lets the industry get rid of its own history of certain destructive production practices. The most simple description is that of gas fracking is that it enables fossil fuel companies to capture previously uncaptured embedded gas. So the example I always use is how in the coal mine they put in a canary, and if the canary gets sick or dies, people know they have to exit the coal mine. Coal seam gas actually tries to capture that methane that's trapped in the rock besides the coal deposits. So it only becomes a kind of desperate extraction practice once all the coal is not profitable or existing. The process involves drilling down into the earth on the left-hand side. One of the innovative technologies was this horizontal drill process. Then it stimulates a micro-earthquake and creates cracks in the rock formations to release trapped gas. What is sent down the pipe is a very long list of proprietary chemicals which until this day have been undisclosed in all nations aiming to regulate the industry. I'll get to that in a second. And once the hydraulic pressure of that chemicalized liquid is removed from the well, the gritty sand and effluents in it hold the fracture open, encouraging the gas in the rock to travel upwards for capture. This is obviously a more realist picture of how that story works. So technically, with the release of the pressure, the fluid travels back up to the surface to be siphoned off as what the industry calls produced water. But in reality, only 50% of fracking fluid comes back up and the rest stays in the earth to toxify whatever the surroundings are. Is that clear enough? The dots coming off the siphon here are also evidencing that methane leaks through all parts of the process. So insofar as the crack hits the water table, which it's not supposed to, the water table will bubble with methane gas every time that happens, and it happens a lot. Apart from contamination issues, fracking requires enormous amounts of water, between 5 and 11 million litres for each well drilled. Where it comes from, though, is key to the story. So fracking was approved for install from within the indebted centre of the new economy under the Bush administration when Vice President Dick Cheney helped to pass the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which exempted hydraulic fracturing from federal oversight and from needing to engage with the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974. This gap in the regulation is often referred to as a Halliburton loophole, and it provided the precedent by which companies have argued for special exemption from air and water regulations in whatever later territories the industry has been installed. So also in Australia, the deregulation of environmental monitoring was key to the approval process. This image that you see here is an image of the Cuyahoga River fire in 1969. It's very famous, not because it was the biggest river fire of this river, it was actually quite a small one, but it just happened to happen at the time. This river would catch on fire for months at a time, and it was so polluted that it was impossible to put out, and it was just one of many rivers that would catch fire in the States prior to environmental regulations. And it's in Ohio. So when it happened at this moment, it was the peak of environmental activism in the States, and 2 Times news photographers flew to the river and took this photograph and a series of others. And people historicise it as basically inspiring the first clean water acts in the USA. So currently, I should add that one of the key actors in making the deregulation possible through the US Senate is now the head of the Environmental Protection Agency under Trump. I just wanted to show, to give you an idea of the cultures of settler over-identification and also resistance to the promises of the industry. So we go for the resistance first. And this, I'm showing this not because I love it, but because it's key to whether the strength of the pushback really came from.
437 million hectares of Australia is covered by coal seam gas licences or applications.
The Voice is a right-wing radio show.
I lived in Sydney. It was some of the best times of my life. And then I'd hit 30. What did I have? Nothing. I got on the internet and I found some land in Tara. It's called the Tara Estate. The dream was to develop the property and potentially start a family. One day a guy drove down my driveway and said, "I'm Queensland Gas Company, we're going to sink a well down the back of your place, and if you don't like it, there's nothing you can do about it. Our land sat on top of billions of dollars worth of gas, and the industry, we're going to stop at nothing to get it."
They all say it's safe. I have to live here.
I think nearly every kid in this estate is sick.
There's hydrogen sulphide in the air. That's what's making everyone sick.
Blood just pours out of his nose.
You see friends like this where they actually get angry.
There's nobody out there to help us.
I'm the worst environmental activist this world's ever seen, but in the end, there's the only way to get something done.
This coal seam gas industry is like an old car screaming down the highway with bad brakes and no reverse.
I know this land real well, and I know what you can do if you stuff it up.
This is where all the bad stuff is. The burden's on proof, so we're going to start proving it. What people really need to understand is that gas wells leak. That it's explosive.
Do you think that's a safety issue?
Of course it's a safety issue.
He's just a total accidental activist.
The government and the gas corporation hate you.
This is the biggest con that has been perpetrated on the Australian people since the asbestos disaster. This is precursor to a major destruction of our area.
I'll absolutely guarantee you that that's not normal. I gotta break out. Ordinary people, we've got to step up and become heroes. Things are getting better. If we can't stop this, it's going to destroy the world. Let's go, boys, let's go.
The land's unsellable, it's unlivable, it's un-Australian.
I gotta break out.
My brother is actually playing drums on that awful song. Okay, so as I show this film precisely because the resistance of the white farmers in the beginning was one of the most successful militant social movements in Australia since the beginning of neoliberalisation. And that's also one of the reasons I started studying it. I was interested in grassroots literacy and the difference of these kinds of approval processes.
Rachel, sorry, just when would you say that started, that kind of resistance?
The industry installs around, it's different in different locations, but this film I think is only maybe a year or two old, and so I think the wells started being drilled 2011, 2012. That's a guess, but it's around there. So this new relationship of settler citizenship to extractivist production challenges the geographical conceits of the new economy's post-industrial aura. Issues surrounding the democratic right to water is now becoming contested wherever it is instantiated. Farmers are buying their water in various affected areas. Sometimes the state sells it back to them, and other times before that's arranged, they buy it themselves. The US government spends a lot of money delivering water to fracked farms. Gas-affected areas are literally living, drinking and breathing with the destructiveness of the market, which is politically novel in terms of the appearance to domestic civil culture of extractive industry. And also insofar as the techniques have difficulty, and this is the interesting part, splitting off cleanly those constituents with more political power away from those with less, creating unconventional politics around unconventional extraction that binds people together through negative resource access, rather than through existing class or neoliberalised party political bonds. This woman, these are American images, but you can see, actually we have to do that again, but it's the last time. I want to show one more video that gives you an idea of how the industry wages war through farmers' minds because it needs their land. And this happened more in the US because people have differential property access, so they could game farmers against each other in paying them certain amounts so that they could be at the forefront of installing in particular areas.
Mineral rights make all the difference to our small organic-based farm. Like many Colorado farm-to-table businesses, if we can't offset operating costs with our minerals, then we're out of business. Organic operations are expensive. People like us rely on those payments for their family's health care or their kids' education. An attack on fracking is essentially an attack on landowners like us. Those who would ban fracking ignore our rights, and that just gets my goat.
Yeah. When the first for the first years in the US, one of the reasons why it was slow for this information to come out is not only because there's no information on the industry, but as soon as people complained, they were paid money as gag orders to not tell people what was happening to them on their property. So there you get an image of the unconventional politics. There was a group in the States that has been around for some time called the Cowboy and Indian Alliance. In Australia, some of the more interesting politics around fracking, and not at all obviously where I come from, but up in the Northern Territory in Western Australia, where Indigenous activists are at the forefront of resistance, and the settlers up there are more literate and open to that fact. And there you just get a quick sense of the way in which the industry uses images of labour from older forms of extractive industry to kind of mobilise it as a worthy way to reproduce families. Of course, the contracts are very much smaller than lifetime mining wages, even though they're very well paid. They have very short deadlines. And the book on the left is a book written, funded by the fracking industry, written by a woman who basically gives advice on how to deal with the fact that your husband is always not home working on the fracking industry. The book on the right is a book funded by the mining industry that explicitly gives advice on how to keep a family together under those conditions. So it's totally deregulated in terms of like 19th century wage forms as well. But the wages are high, so the women do stay home and kind of contribute to that 19th century format. Grotius's economic modelling has remained remarkably, and here we're going back to this relationship between water and land through the port. So this book on the left is the only history book written about the city where I grew up. The gas was installed on a special economic zone, and it's a key export hub of Queensland's mineral wealth. In the text, because of the efforts of colonial anthropologists, there's a lot of information on Indigenous people in the first chapter leading up to the 1930s, and then they entirely disappear for 50 years to turn up to the 1988 bicentenary picnic as two original inhabitants rather than the 5,000 Indigenous and Islander people who live in the city of 30,000 people. So I find this generates a lot of possibilities for cultural work. The image on the right is an image of the only Indigenous artefact in the Maritime Museum, and since doing this project I'm fascinated by the whiteness of maritime museums. And it's a canoe that's stabbed with suspension sticks to keep it there, and it sits outside and rots. And when I asked the volunteers who run this volunteer museum, what the provenance was, of course I didn't use the word provenance, they said to me, oh yeah, that thing, we're not even sure it floats, it could be fake, we have no idea where it came from. So that lack of curiosity through this history of property is what I'm kind of talking about. And there you get a picture of the success of settler propertisation in Australia. It's the only country where there weren't treaties signed with Indigenous people, though there were some efforts to do that. None of them succeeded. So until 65, we have no Indigenous land rights until the image goes to 2013, but this is native title and not really land rights. So there's symbolic rights of access to fish and hunt traditionally, and do certain, and reproduce culture that is understood as not an economic thing. And it's only in the last, since the Mabo decision, that we have native title being assigned. So property is conventionally understood as a bundle of rights and resources that are embedded in social relations through which some people do or do not recognise the property rights of other people. That's the definition. All property relations, including landed property, is therefore social, although many social relations are not property relations. At the same time, Marx argued, among others, that the very concept of property conceals social relations between people by representing them as rights that people can exercise independently of each other. So we have here a combination. So Marx defined social relations of production through both property rights and labour relations. And this is the Australian history, which I only discovered through doing this research. The Australian history makes a particular contribution to the history of global property rights. Interestingly, in the British common law system extending from feudalism, so before industrialisation, knowing and adjudicating the legal owner of a piece of land did not used to require the involvement of the Crown nor of a public ownership register. Since it was legally impossible to own land in England directly, all land was leased as an estate from the Crown, and title was relatively inferred through possession in the absence of contesting claims. Outside of supervision, property transfers were made legal by contractual one-to-one relations. The system assumed that physical possession was key. Prior or other rights could also accrue, for example, by squatting, and failure to occupy the land could be used as a reason to pass on or transfer an estate. Here, the social security of ownership occupied less through official infrastructure than through local knowledge and community memory, braided through specifically patriarchal genealogies of inheritance. The land is a fragile commodity in medieval times, since it involves elaborate rituals of transfer, incorporating swords, cuts of turfs, the various ranges of practices that require performing so that who owns the land becomes embedded in public memory. It's called, by Sarah Keenan, knowing owning through spatio-temporal relations that don't draw on clock time, but involve more of a temporality of a practical orientation to the world. The common law was locally rather than universally significant, and so even when ownership becomes more secured in writing, paper, testimony, and more professional bureaucracies of land inspection, the ritual nature of verification and transfer remains intact for the purposes of socialising the legal writ and memorising and genealogically connecting ownership into places. Until 1875 in Britain, the prospective purchase and legal adjudication of a title transfer required a paper record of a chain of title of 60 continuous years. And that temporal base point assumed that before those 60 years, it was unlikely that a rival claimant would emerge to contest the claim. The chain essentially stored the past of the land in a set packet of time, not arbitrarily resemblant of the landed gentry's life expectancy. But it also included provisions for future transformations of family attachments. So you could write, the man could write, I would like so-and-so to inherit this and not that person, in ways that keep land locked to particular male heads of families well after their death through singular deeds. Switching back to this history of innovation, or forward, shall we say, on the right-hand side, you see this kind of mercantile image of land dematerialised from land, a block of land dematerialised from land, that is used to make the industry exemplary of an investment prospect. The gas fracking technology, it floats like a ship on its background. Note the conceitful verticality of the extractive process as well. You see only one well, a few trucks, holding ponds in the countryside, a single pipe descends from well beneath the water table. There's green forest, no houses, although there's a very brown storage water tank as a holding pond. The right-hand side image I use in my drawings because it's the exact image, graphic design image that was used to improve the GLNG gas infrastructure for the state of Queensland. In it, you have just one well seam, one field compression station, one pressing plant and one gas ship, some living livestock and one water treatment plant in a design meant to capture the installation of more than 60,000 wellheads at unknown urban and rural locations where the precise models of the wellheads was also unknown at the moment of approval. The GLNG company doesn't show the Great Artesian Basin, the underground water system which is beneath this, that is one of the largest underground interconnected water basins on one of the driest planets on Earth. So it obviously has there's nothing mathematical about this diagram, it's pure propaganda, but it goes into the supposedly scientific environmental report to promote the ease of installation of the industry. Reading backwards from these images of fully realised dematerialisation, it's interesting that when English civilians were being encouraged to claim private properties for sheep farming in South Australia, hang on. Sorry, need to get some water. For sheep farming in South Australia, where am I? From the 1830s onwards, as the penal colony's first free settlers, the precise placements of tracts of land, despite the advancement of modern surveillance by this time, the precise placements of tracts of land often then, as here, remained underdetermined while capital was being raised and legislation was being passed to make the project viable. In the beginning, speculation was rife with land orders. Land orders being a colonial innovation of buying land that was uninspected. And many investors had no plans to ever move to Australia, while legal fees to secure holdings were much often higher than the cost of the land itself. So in other words, more at stake in both of these situations than precise location, and coupled with mercantile expectation, is the financial securitization of the will towards settlement and financial rewards of possession as such. And it's at this moment in the early colonial history that reform was needed to make the distant system work and to encourage continued settlement as fortune seeking. So this is the policy. This quote, "To make land as easily transferable as stock would be one of the greatest economical improvements which could be bestowed upon the country." That's John Stuart Mill. He's actually talking about England and the annoyance of the aristocracy sitting on land that could be put to much better work. So in 1957, in England, a royal commission into the systemic inefficiencies of common land law proposed the introduction of a title registering system to England to ease the movement of so-called freehold land to more closely match the ease of transfer of stocks and shares. That was the idea, despite this being counter to the interests of much of the upper classes, solicitors and aristocracy. So the system was only installed incrementally from 1862 because it wasn't popular. But what made it possible, what it wanted to make possible, was that any person, technically, regardless of birthplace and genealogy, could legally and outright purchase property. Serious concerns from solicitors and aristocrats was that the new system could potentially diminish the social value of title as such, while also stripping land itself from existing social understandings of the meaning and perpetuity of aristocratic citizenship. In Kearns' words, during a moment of increasing political enfranchisement, the concern was that the multi-generational aristocratic hold on land might even begin to seem unnatural. So this is the settler colonial experiment in that unnaturalness. Just 2 years after the debate in Parliament, a customs officer called Robert Richard Torrens, with no legal training whatsoever, proposed a title registry system for the sales and settlement of the first free land in South Australia that I was talking about before, mostly for sheep property. He'd been involved with the issuing of clean, fresh titles to Irish estates that had been bankrupted by the potato famine, and I think his father was head of the colonial administration in Ireland. His formative experience with the system of registration as a shipping officer in England and in South Australia meant that he was influenced by the shipping industry to create a vision of landed property as a commodity entirely abstracted from prior relations of ownership and to whatever degree possible from particular and individualised characters or traits. So those individualised characters or traits were the things that people wanted to inspect before they bought a property. One of the many objections to his system of registration, which was also obviously, as I said before, being discussed in England, was that unlike funded property, landed property was subtended by facts of occupation, possession, and individual character. Torrens creatively responded to these objections by elaborating by what he saw as the likeness between funded property that was movable and landed fixed property. He said, this objection of the score of difference in essential attributes disappears like a mirage upon investigating closely the nature of property and shipping. Like land, a ship is even more indivisible and also bears the trait of individuality. Obviously, he's just twisting the game. Richard Torrens' sleight of hand is this, and these are quotes from him, in his much longer argument for why this flip should happen. In playing out the game of land in this workaday part of the globe, meaning Australia, we require something less costly, less artificial, with which we may handle with more freedom and rapidity. If the comparative indivisibility in land constitutes a difficulty, it exists in a yet greater degree in a ship. Here also we find the characteristic of individuality. We must identify the particular ship to be transferred by a long description in the register. Here again, the contingency of adverse possession requires to be guarded against. Finally, the attribute of immobility renders transfer by registration more suitable for property than for shipping, which may be removed beyond the canon jurisdiction of the registering officer. So he's saying it's even better that land could be registered through the system because land never disappears and ships can disappear. So you get the idea. Interestingly, the private company, this process was set in motion not by the British state or by the early colonial administration, but by private companies, the South Australian Colonisation Company, which raised funds not from the British government, but from private individuals that bought so-called unexplored land destined for settlement at a price of 12 shillings per acre. How much is that? The whole project was calculated on probable revenues from settlers whose land sites were considered entirely unknown. The Act provided the raising of a loan security and the state an investment in government securities to protect England from the liabilities that might result from a bad course of colonisation. Thus, the settler invasion was speculatively financed as a privatised project from the very beginning, with early techniques of finance capitalism that we see in other mercantile governance and manoeuvres of this time. Some of you would know Rediker's work on the birth of insurance with the Middle Passage and slave boats. So this role of finance in land titling tends to be downplayed in emphasis, and this is one of my key points and one of my obsessions with doing this research. This role and this system and this history is underknown and tends to be downplayed in relationship to the discourse or the narrative that Australia was colonised through the force of the fiction of terra nullius, meaning nobody's land. But actually it's been proven by legal historians that it was not until 80 years into the colonial project that discourse of terra nullius actually ends up in law courts in Australia or in Britain. So it turns out that the legal fiction is actually itself a fiction, an historical fiction, but one retroactively installed into legal writ in order to have some kind of story about how colonisation was approved. So if that didn't happen, then we need to pay greater attention to these other legal techniques customised that create this history and persistence of normative dispossession. The specific technicity of the system I just wanted to mention, it's called the mirror, the curtain, and the insurance principle. The first two are the innovations. The mirror says that the landowner's document is the mirror of the state's document, and when you hold it up, you see the owner and the right of the state. So it's super Hegelian, and it basically just says that it's a two-dimensional system, and anyone outside of that kind of struggle of recognition is not included as part of the story. The curtain system is more interesting, and it says that that to state that the register is the sole source of information, the legal owner is allowed to draw a curtain through being on the title record, can draw a curtain confidently behind them through the fact that they have the title. So it doesn't mean, when this system is described, it doesn't actually mean that that other possible owners don't exist. It just means that you're permitted through your property right to ignore their claims. So it's quite literally a curtain on history. So Torrens title made it possible to fully dematerialise land from messy inheritances, but also from its material connection to reality through this kind of double bookkeeping system. The person named with the proof of paper has an infeasible title that the state, for the first time in history, or British history, guarantees. Gone was the 60-year chain since the land was considered through Lockean rationality to be occupied. So, as in the States, the absence of large amounts of built infrastructure and industrialised agriculture basically said that an Indigenous person is not labouring in their land to deserve their land. So that discourse of work became key to the settler attachment to land. In the repetition of this historyless maritemporal inception, state-secured land was gifted with an extreme ease of transfer and speculation to become the norm of settler property form. And after it's in Australia, it goes very quickly. Torrens himself visits Canada to inspire the shift to Torrens title system in Canada. It moved to Israel and to the Philippines, areas of the US, and it's now the preferred property titling system of the IMF, and it's used throughout Southeast Asia as a productive way to dispossess peasants from land in order to cultivate certain kinds of development, but also where it's also used against Indigenous land that's being scoped up and mapped for the first time in order to be sold to the state, or in order to encourage Indigenous peoples to sell their land. And peasants, so Indigenous, in Southeast Asia, sometimes peasants is the more appropriate word. With similar attention, the discourse around it gets increasingly fascinating. So Torrensing is essentially, as we understand it through this longer history now, it's essentially a kind of land manufacturing system built entirely on paper and administrative infrastructure. Ruoff praised it almost clinically to say that it cures anterior defects And once it's installed, all investigations of the history of how the named owner came to be entitled is ruled out forever, and all future transactions are carried out by simple forms and simple machinery. Greg Taylor went further to describe the Torrens system as a hospital. It does make things better, cures invalidities, and makes people's titles certain. It does this once registration has occurred by taking away the need to show the registered owner's title in the land. It therefore means that the end of the need to look backwards for possible flaws. So it's a kind of hospital for land history and colonial subjectivity. We know, I might skip that part, I'm running out of time. So, in the settler colonies, after the abolition of slavery in the US, there was also slavery on the east coast of Australia, where some of these industries are installed for cane farming, which not a lot of Australians know. And the flittery emergence of Indigenous rights, if not law or economy. Whiteness as property retains its value beyond the reserve system and the convict lease system through contemporary mortgage implosions and prison system development, all in ways that dialogue with this racialised history of statecraft. The land, as ever, calls the will to appropriate and extract within a visual economy of controlled terrain that seduces its masters into shallow unidirectional relationships to it through an intimidatingly sublime array of speculative images. On the left-hand side up there you have a company image used to sell the job in Gladstone to fly-in, fly-out workers. And we saw in the previous set of images from that kind of company advertising, they're solving the problem of the women's loneliness and being taken out of the workforce by just giving them a double income of these fly-in, fly-out wages, which would make them a very high-income family, let's put it like that. Space is filled with lore and form at a distance, and these are the habits of property that in the natural law thinkers did not need to especially cultivate. The settler cultures designed in incapacity for retrospection, including at the level of individuated self-concepts, marks no less than the impact of a secured history of dispossession, where cultural contouring through value, in the history of value, only shows up real abstractions that continue to differentiate vulnerabilities into very different regimes of social production. I mentioned that the Northern Territory fracking protests are very much Indigenous-led, and there's an image of those. I'm kind of saying that this is a kind of spectre of mercantilism, but I'm not a historian, and I'm not suggesting that that's a confident summary of what's going on. I just want to think about what that period is and how these residues of mercantile law actually speak to the difference of present forms and reactionary forms of political economy in the present. So Wallerstein talked about the capitalist world economy as being based on supposedly objectively endless accumulations of capital, which can only be reached through constant expansion resulting in an increased demand for natural resources. However, natural resources are not endless, and the world system is a closed, integrated zone. We increasingly discover this through coming up against what Jason W. Moore calls the end of the four chiefs. My students can summarise what they are because I've only written two of them. Labour, raw materials. That's raw materials. Anyway, it was a highlight text in our class. Which show up, and those four chiefs show up in contemporary events and indexes of genocides and ecocides, including, and this is another talk, the deaths of environmental activists in the South, many of the high-profile ones being not incidentally women. Today, contemporary forms of mercantilism seem to performatively return, at least spectrally, through reproductive crises from an archaic economic culture in which economic advantage was hooked to investments in powerful Christian statehood enveloping the productivity of private firms. Adam Smith described the mercantile system of political economy, and he thought it was silly, as aiming to enrich the country by restraining imports and encouraging exports, and derided it as being bound to a static conception of the total economic resources of the world, thus assuming fundamental disharmony and endless commercial war. Forming at the beginning, the mercantile system forming at the beginning of what More called the Capitalocene from the 15th century onwards, so here we're kind of pre-mass industry. Mercantile governance is apparently deluded fixation on scarcity between the 16th to the 18th centuries, aimed to achieve a favourable balance of one's own trade in relationship to all others. So we're bringing in gold and silver into the country and maintaining domestic employment without being interested in developing distant sites of production, which at that time were the colonies. In contrast to the agricultural attentiveness of the physiocrats in France or laissez-faire liberals of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the mercantile system majoritatively served the interests of merchants and corporate bodies, such as the British and Dutch East India Company, whose activities were protected or encouraged by an enveloping state that was geared towards its interest. Heckscher spoke of the tragedy of mercantilism as the belief that what was one man's or one country's gain was another's loss. Adam Smith and David Hume wrote against this assumption of governmentality, and Hume less along the lines of Smith's case-making for the invisible hand, and more in terms of the negativity that comes, the negative history that comes from the jealousy of trade. I don't know if you can read that, but this is an excerpt from that book. The increase of domestic industry lays the foundation of foreign commerce. Where a great number of commodities are raised and perfected for the home market, there will always be found some which can be exported with advantage. But if our neighbours have no art or civilization, they cannot take them, because they will have nothing to give in exchange. Nor need any state entertain apprehensions that their neighbours will improve to such a degree in every art and manufacture as to have no demand from them. Nature, by giving a diversity of geniuses, climates and soils to different nations, has secured their mutual intercourse and commerce as long as they all remain industrious and civilised. Nay, the more the arts increase in any state, the more will be its demands from its industrious neighbours. The inhabitants, having become opulent and skilful, desire to have every commodity in the utmost perfection, and as they have plenty of commodities to give in exchange, they make large importations from every foreign country. The industry of nations from whom they import receives encouragement. Their own is also increased by the sale of the commodities which they give in exchange, etc., etc. So if we consider this discourse of the free seas as one of many design products of the mercantile era, we might consider that traces of mercantilism tendentially refire where the ideology of neoliberalism as a kind of globalism is faltering on the side of accumulation. When mobile capital moves less on ships than through special economic zones, productivity in an expulsive economy requires new geopolitical strategies and market integration able to be fractally produced to create new situated proletarianizations in other spaces. Cheapened, enslaved or indentured labour and cheap eco-sided natures remains key, while new borders and zoning laws are what produce or even manufacture capital mobility against regulations. And there's a lot of work addressing this, right? Proliferating complexities of these operations in the contemporary, but much of it is tracking spatial economic patterning of large-scale land grabs in a fairly generic and template sense, while giving limited attention to the racial productivity of land zoning. In order to read that together with the spaces of capital, understandings of racial capitalism within natural law and the continuity of natural law in and through the property form enables us to think through processes of real abstraction that create this liquidity and fungibility of land for capital in the first place. And this is So yeah, I mean, in the epic version of this talk, I get to the Dutch dredging company, which is a particular obsession of mine. But that's part 2. But this is a painting by Richard Bell, if you haven't seen it. And for holding these thoughts together around mercantile culture, maritime law, and normotic forms of settler subjectivity. And normotic comes from Christopher Bolas's description of a person who tries to be so normal that they almost become a commodity. I think that's a good example of mercantile subject formation. In the context of ongoing dispossessions, in Australia, I don't know if you know, but land rights are being wound back not only by mining projects, but also by the creation of false scares and welfare accusations that try to create special states of exception for over-policing Indigenous territories where land rights have already been symbolically allocated. So the Northern Territory intervention is now 10 years in the making, and is still being run through a kind of police state up there. This painting by Richard Bell is called aptly Dredging Up the Past, and it appropriates the famous 1975 photograph of the Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam sprinkling earth in the hands of Vincent Lingiari to hand back Wave Hill Station to the Gurindji people. 9 years prior to this, in 1966, about 200 people, including stockmen, servants and their families, walked off Wave Hill Station, prompted by Lord Vestey's refusal to grant equal pay to Indigenous workers who had previously been paid with rations of flour, sugar, tea, tobacco and beef scraps. The group set up camp at a place where the community of Daiguragu now sits, and began an 8-year protest led by Mr. Lingiari, demanding nothing less than the return of their traditional lands. In Bell's work, a land rights, who came into art as a land rights activist and is now a full-time artist, the actual substance of the land is entirely removed from the painting. The transformative legal gesture of Whitlam or the state is empty, or it is revealed to be empty in retrospect, such that the gesture's promise has no way of materialising because of this empty intentionality. But without contradicting that reading, we could also say that, noting the absent earth and the presence of the promise by legal writ, that land is always already insubstantial in and for the settler system of embedded mercantile governance, such that incommensurable ontologies show up only in the persistent derealisation of efforts at transformative justice. Bell works with an Indigenous present of a next generation of militant activism, tarrying with the increasing possibility of the state's discussion of never realised treaty agreements. So the state has actually never said, let's talk about a treaty. There's different waves in which the demand for a treaty has taken place, and we're seeing a new, in response to especially to the Northern Territory intervention and the solidarity of urban activism in relationship to what's happening in Indigenous communities, the strength of that resistance has put treaty back on the table. So that presents new forms of cautious activistic labours, if not optimism, around settler appetites of administrative and executive control, for which historical literacy remains a genuine struggle against real abstractions at the level of a colonial designed and landed being. That's the end. I said that I'd read a poem, but maybe after the questions.
Maybe you should just read a poem and then you can, I think it would be nice to hear. Maybe do it first. Set the tone.
Set the tone. Angry. So I wrote, actually, Annie, the last time you saw me read a poem from this project was the first drafts that I produced after I went to a Healthy Harbour meeting after the mass fish kills in Gladstone. And it was on a Monday from 9 to 5 in a city at that time during the boom of something like 3% unemployment. So the only people that could be there were the people that were paid by the industry to be there, and the single retiree activist and a few of the fishermen that were concerned that they were ruining the harbour, and me. And I was so unused to them having any kind of public forums in the city where I lived for 20 years that I thought I had to be a member of the environment group. So I joined them to go to the meeting, which is a big mistake because they treated me like a moron for 8 hours. But our job was basically to sit around these maps, and they'd marked out, and anyone who's seen dredging projects, this is the kind of map that they look like. They've marked out particular uses for different parts of the water that's obviously all connected to each other. And some of the uses are for fishing, some of them are for effluent dumping, some of them are for swimming, some of them are for boating, some of them are for looking at the water aesthetically. No joke, that's a category. And we had to sit around this table and check that what they'd allocated was correct or not. Already that's ridiculous, but, and of course we had no idea if the whole thing was a farce and any of these maps were going to be used for anything at all. But what was interesting was sitting there watching the fishermen know, obviously, much more about what the harbour was used for than anyone in the room. And they were using their mobile phones to call their friends and ask them, hey, you know, on this corner where that pipe goes into that water, is there this happening there or that happening there? And the extent to which the documentation was changed by the fishermen was quite extreme. The text on the right-hand side, I said I was finished. The text on the right-hand side is the only Marxist research project on the history of the industry, and environment never appears as a chapter in that, except for when the toilets overflow, when there's too many workers coming to town and they're worried about toxic sewage. So you get an idea of the kind of imagination that I'm dealing with. So anyway, I wrote a version of the poem that was very sad and weirdly Christian and modernist and waiting for colonial science to turn up and save the day. And I didn't mind it when I wrote it, but after a year or something, I just thought it was ridiculous. And I thought I had to write an angry poem instead. And I mean, maybe I'm not that angry, but we'll find out. So it's called Rue Methanic, formerly a mourning poem. And so it's me sitting there at the ladies' table being told that actually if we wanted to learn something we should break up and sit with the engineers and talk about the maps with the engineers. That literally was how we were treated at this meeting. You cannot point out directly that they killed language. You must say things like, oh, it would be a great strain on the other government systems if all of us looked out each day to see large portions of the ocean dead and dying like this. At the table of propositions, we know we are not true if we don't interest. We might just be pure repulsion, but this is still a strong relation. We might fit in, oh, shouldn't we be looking for some substrate common to blood, plants, petroleum? We could find out that we share certain things to a high degree. That would mean mixing. The woman known to the engineers as Bloody Cheryl says this, so it is a scientific statement by a person in the woman category, well known beyond that, who has no qualifications but is very well read and especially well fielded. This category performativity seems just too dialectical already to the engineer not paid extra for the adventure of his own research. Another unpaid woman stands to say, why are turtles being these only things? Oh yeah, we had to sit around and say which species we would prefer them to prioritise saving as well. That was the other hilarious moment in the meeting. So we opted for seagrass, turtles and dugongs. I took the authority of the people that live there as to how to rank those things. Another unpaid woman stands to say, why are turtles being these only things? Why count them? Another says we need to count them because they won't let us be counting anything else. They think our job is aesthetics. They think aesthetics is consultation. We have turtles, dugongs, and a range of migratory seabirds, and a certain percentage of seagrass legible. I am not saying we should go with this, but this seems to be what is naming here. If we widen the stuff closer to insights beyond the shape, we send the water guys into the world of the things, which is not exclusively a problem of language, but also the limits of certain education. We don't know what they know about words being or not the things they stand them for, so the trouble continues as it never really enough begins. Post-war German poetry called deforestation this need to level out where naming might happen fresh. The poem Inventory simply named the few objects that belonged to the speaker. Dugong seagrass is clearly not that moment now. The water guy is staring at us as if we are inventing problems with abstraction as such, haha, and unseen feelings about them as people. We are studying their avoidance of their particular grammatical voices or modes, their tendencies to constantly use the first conditional and to avoid the second and third conditional. What if we just drop style and telegraph, use no dredging photos whatsoever? More important in this context seems the banning of certain parts of it. We must give the impression of a rapid or vague perception that has no time and does not take the trouble to attribute any negative qualities to any of their objects whatsoever. This is hard to do, but it seems clear we must merely string nouns together now as they are doing, and only to stop the game. I'm not saying this is our labour, I'm just saying this is where we are. It's clear only because it's their poem that's starting. They seem to say things mainly when they can express a feeling of amputation with equilibrium. They only quote us when they can add an equilibrium to an amputation. They break only with what is conventional in language, but they never thought of breaking any language. The total effect seems that of a weird, superpersonal, cosmic, pesmic, ambitious action to which agents seem much more caught than acting, and in which the agents mic up to know that they don't matter. The problem is this husbanding of reference, that they're there only counts for them, and that they're there, everything's still done with the nouns. The effect coincides with this stasis of slaughter. Can the same stasis be something for us? It is they that now thin things out, either towards silence or towards all sides. Hurry up, the superemployed guy says to the woman's table. You've got no shots to show you no labour here. In the break he says, okay, so that was a bit much, so okay, he says, you've got one. I said, one shot, like what, like difficulty or like your job? I said, okay, so you know how the film at the turn of the century loops and the workers leave the factory and the women in those bonnets just happen to run faster and all of them exit, mostly in the direction of the left of the screen, and the men run quite a bit slower and kind of exit all over the place. Well, the voiceover of the history image is never really quite curious about that still. That, my dear, I said to him, is some labour of consulting. It is a shame, that life that kept us private on the outskirts of the problem harbour, that delayed making friends from similar subtropical environments. For so many years to have called boom home and never tossed a coin and still inherit something, and only now be proving more mobile than money in several countries, surviving on text work in the wings of a talkback unit, printing and palming autonomy and mercy. One day I swear to know whose work the fathers paid for equally and who they paid unequally, and whether their shearers' stock they shared as tea or as revolution beyond just sheep anxiety, and the exact dates that they turned them to love some things resembling justice. Then playing dead will not be regional dancing, from which, sure, there have been so many lateral achievements. Oh hi, I used to be lying down here weighing fish for the local paper, picking up response genres to the Murdoch hole. Submission-based access to the social section is knowledge still. What kind of a mackerel was for quite some time then. Those years the mine image climbed high to death knolls on highways and underground protein powder profits. I imagined people where people weren't, able to negate acid sulfate soils with their own bodies, have skin in the space where none of us ever tried to be seduced, because it would have cancelled the only language available. I stayed up all night after then reading the others' poems and then some of mine, and I wasn't being competitive, or this is not a word for it. I wanted to know where one of us had moved the other at any point from any otherwise at any time, or were we just standing at the translation bar posing from a liberal lyric positions manual? Who looked for who might have gone through more ranges? Because we said we can't trust the rangers are there. We never trust there's a person there. There really is no anxiety of selves not knowing what to ask for. And now this alt-swallowing of neutrality is unheard of. Sends ex-Catholic prom and youth values, however, as cached anger as algorithms of poetry itself. We cannot be sad anymore that the whole world is poets, so much as seawater neutralisation should not be a management method for new developments. Oh wording, oh worlding, no bedtime, no envy. For every one that the we failed to turn, someone is truly sorry for Catholic water messages.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was extraordinary, both lecture and poem. Wow, what a force, really amazing. Yeah, I have one question, but I also just want to open it out to the floor a bit. Super interesting to hear this kind of history of this abstraction of the mercantile and the way it sort of relates to land and how speculative it was and how it has been adapted. And of course, if you think about the Netherlands, I think you were saying that you're beginning to sort of develop a research on this and the sort of national mythology which rejoices in the idea of the mercantile. I'm sort of curious, yeah, where is that research leading you, or is it very different, or has the model in which the Netherlands sort of developed a kind of management of the land and its like aside from its sort of internal industrialization, its colonial sort of moment, has that been also co-opted in the same way as the British model, or not?
Yeah. One of the we did a roaming assembly a little bit on this topic. It was called Infrastructural Rifts, and it came together around destructive infrastructure projects in Indonesia. And one of the things that we did manage to talk about by finding the right people was the record of the Dutch dredging company in the south, which is complicated and obviously very long, but I don't know if people know that as basically a very large portion of the very large numbers of dredging companies in the world are Dutch, and they all compete for contracts in the south, and the record of those companies in the Netherlands is extremely positive. We saw as part of the Dye roaming project that they're beginning to be studied by an organisation called the Centre for Research on Multinational Organisations based in the Netherlands, and they have been tracking the destruction and ecocide, but also human rights violations of dredges in the Panama Canal, or Suez maybe. But also we had that conversation because they're starting to look at the record of Dutch dredging companies in Indonesia, and for the expansion of the Jakarta Harbour project, but also for multiple harbour projects, not just in Indonesia, but also through India and many other places. Some of these large-scale harbour projects are so big that they're using the majority of dredging boats available in the world to dredge material from the base. But when you look at the way these models are planned, because of the scale of them, because they're so large scale, the company and the state will say, well, we don't have any decent environmental assessment that we can give beforehand because this is like an unprecedented scale project. So it's like as the project gets more dangerous, deregulation happens sheerly through that kind of gesture. And I don't think people... the problem is that you can put a lot of thought into dredging, or you can put much less thought into dredging. So depending on which scientist you're working on the dredging project, some of the interestingly intellectual dredging is happening around New York City, as you can imagine. And the continuous effort to dredge the New York Harbour, it coincides with the largest range of experts thinking through like the cutting edge of dredging materially and in relationships to the kind of molecules that they're trying to move around through the harbour. And some dredging is restorative, so it's not all destructive. But often in the south, there's nowhere near the level of thought that gets put into the project, so the exact same technology can ruin entire fishing industries, you know, through the space of months. And in the case of the Gladstone Harbour, it still hasn't, like its fishing resources still hasn't recovered, and that's like more than 4 or 5 years down the track, basically. But yeah, I mean, what's fascinating about it is if you talk to people that, like there's artists that do work with dredging companies in the Netherlands, for example, and what's interesting about the dredging company is that it has this fully objectivized conception of matter. So it will go into one location and pick up seagrass from there because that place needs to be used for something else. And then if it thinks that it puts that stuff over here, then it calls that a lossless transfer of environmental values. So the system is built on this global concept of moving one thing into another location, like chess or something, without acknowledging the complexity of all of these systems that are not mechanical, basically.
No questions? No comments? Come on now, especially from your class.
Well, not on the immediate scale, just a lot.
Yeah, just anything. Just, yeah. It's nice to have that.
What are the 4 sheets?
Sorry?
The 4 sheets. Labour, raw materials. That's all I can think of.
Production. Yeah.
Bonus point if you know it.
Yeah, we did it in Mercantile, right? No, not Mercantile. One before.
I didn't really talk about the practice part. I thought if I'd put the museum in there, something would emerge from the museum thinkers.
Maybe it's nice to talk a little bit about, I mean, for me what's so interesting in relation to both the historical kind of imagining of the contemporary moment of the colonial, like literally this idea of what following the money, right? I mean, understanding the Dutch, what they're doing, understanding where exactly the management of the land in its sort of extractive and accumulative sort of potential is really fascinating and interesting to link back to different places. So is that something that you might be working on a bit with, not only within your research, but within what you might do with Vivian as part of Frontier Imaginaries in the next year here?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, maybe it's too soon.
I mean, I tend to do research first and then think of what form it needs to be after that.
Yeah.
And so this project, it actually started as a failed non-fiction experimentation, and I was at the Jan van Eyck with 35 visual artists, and I was failing to write a coherent narrative, and nobody really was that interested in reading the weird drafts of things that I was writing. But I was also really blocked, mainly for this reason, that every single piece of knowledge I had before the project was whistleblown was basically, uncertifiable facts that masquerade as gossip. So if I actually succeeded in writing the thing, which I don't think I would have under those circumstances, I would have possibly gone to court anyway, if it was a good book. But I was basically having studio visits with mostly visual artists, mostly men at the time actually, and I was drawing the argument in these weird diagrams and explaining the analysis that I was trying to do and which parts of the narrative needed to be dealt with in particular ways. And after way too many of these studio visits, I realised that the diagrams were actually quite useful in themselves, and I worked with an architect couple who were super easygoing collaborators, Vaya Medina and Benjamin Reynolds, who have a group called, I'm losing my brain power. Anyway, they worked with me to map out all of the arguments in 3D software, which was extremely fun because we were kind of doing these clunky diagrams that were just as clunky as the engineer's diagrams, but even better and even terrible. So that computation process became a kind of pleasure of thinking about representation in mathematics through the sheer difference between what was trying to be said and how clunkily you have to say it in these kinds of apparatuses. And I did the first 2 series of the drawings, which are arguments. The first series is about the difference between modern vertical mining and horizontal fracking. The second series, which was the first time I actually got funded, which Vivian organised through the presentation of Frontier Imaginaries in Brisbane, enabled me to go back to Gladstone and work with the people that I've been talking to document the Gladstone story analytically. And be more in dialogue with the Indigenous elders there, who are also friends of my family, which makes a big difference. And there are all these outcomes that need to happen regardless of whether they're part of the project or not. So one of the things I want to do is also record the gospel rock band of the Indigenous elders, because they're getting on and they reproduce their spirit through these weird gospel songs on the Casio keyboard. I don't think that is going to be, I prefer that not to be part of it, but it is part of what I'll use my money to go and do with them. They also have a book of their language, Garangaring language, which was copyrighted by an anthropologist, and so is unavailable for reproduction. So we need to find that and kind of extract the information from it and reprint that. And that's like the local museum collaboration. So basically every time I do something, I try to think about where it's spatially, which spatial configuration is being asked of the research. So here I did research on Dutch stuff, Dutch dredging that didn't come into the material because I was also communicating there to here. But every time I try to put some work into thinking what part of the extractive industry imagination makes sense to talk about in which location. So when I went to the UK, I talked more about coal mining, that kind of pedagogical part of it I find extremely pleasurable, actually. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you how your research informs your work as a poet. I mean, how your research informs your work as a poet, otherwise than just more emotional guttural reaction based on your own experience being there in the specific meeting with the engineers, etc. Does it make you somehow also change the form, or you speak a lot of horizontal, vertical things about appropriation. Is this something that also directs your ideas about poetry, about the form of poetry? Because it's funny. 2 years ago, you presented one of the first acts.
Yeah.
I remember. And the seminar the title of the seminar had to do with poetry.
Yeah.
But we heard nothing about poetry. And it was so mysterious that I wanted to subscribe to that. So this is how it happened. And I now understand better how things relate to each other, but I want to hear.
Yeah. How do I answer that question? I mean, when we talked about Christian Marazzi's work on capital and language, this entire project started as what it is straight after I attended that meeting, and I was so amazed and shocked and just mentally disorganized and intellectually disorganized and socially disorganized by how they were using language at that meeting. I mean, it was such a joke, the vocabulary, the the extent to which they were kind of policing. It was impossible to tell whether they were policing the words that you could use in that meeting, or their vocabulary was so destroyed by being technocrats that it was extremely mysterious to me what we're actually communicating to in that kind of location. And I immediately started, I was totally innovated by their destruction of language to try to figure out how they were destroying it in relationship to what kinds of knowledge projects or mapping projects. But also I learn things from how people use language. So it doesn't matter what kind of vocabulary anyone has. If I know something about what they're talking about, you can learn a lot from particular kind of vocabulary performances or defensive kinds of neutral language and these kinds of things. And it was precisely the extent to which they were destroying language which made me extremely interested in this as a project that was about poetics, corporate poetics, technocratic poetics, and if I felt less responsibility to communicate other parts of the project, I would want the poetry to be the most ambitious part of it, actually. Yeah.
I hesitate asking this because it seems such a banal topic and not at all dealing with the importances within your talk. So what seems to me important, I cannot ask anything about at the moment because it's just still computing in my mind. So this is really a side thing. Early on in the talk you're mentioning Sekula and you're classifying him immediately after you mention him as a settler colonial artist. And this blew me, and I didn't quite understand why. So why is it important, you know, if he's mentioned there, to declassify him in a certain way, delegitimize him, his work? Why is this being classified as settler colonial artist and work by someone else like Vivian or yourself is not classified in the same register? What are the categories? And then what is the role of art within your talk? I don't quite understand, because it seems to me that actually art is so unimportant and the thing you're doing is so important. And if you're using poetry in that, it's also really important. And to reduce that into even a context of giving this lecture here, which as actually we are all profiting from, so it has a meaning. I'm not saying, but it's you know, it should be somewhere else.
Yeah, yeah.
And why is it important from your perspective to keep insisting on this category and to deal with that category, or you to frame within your
Yeah, I can answer that one. I've nearly quit art a million times because I am really interested in politics, but I am very, you know, art infrastructure was what I had and what I travelled through until I was like 30 years old or something. And I do use, you know, invitations or, you know, small amounts of money to do research that does travel outside of art space. So when I go back to Australia, I do mostly art or academic talks, but I always make sure that I'm not just having artists in the room, because often it is very one way. I'm telling them something that's really interesting, especially in the capital cities. But also in Australia, honestly, the relationship between the environmental activist scene and the art scene, more than any other split, is the biggest split. And I mean, there are lots of reasons why that's the case, but I I also feel like I'm performing an interest in citizenship in cultural space that I think is important. And that's very, it's so cliched to, it's such a convention to not be involved in any way in practical politics, in properly political artistic autonomy, that it's often unclear to me whether people have thought that through or whether they just say that that's their position on politics as an artist because that's what artists told them to say about politics. So I'm interested in helping people shamelessly get to the point where they either realise that they're not interested in being citizens or they are interested in being citizens. And that happened most clearly to me when my art life was basically destroyed by me doing a research project about my old institution, right? As if I would ever get a job as a curator in Australia if I've done this. I mean, maybe I would because it sounds sexy when I'm not doing it in Australia. I definitely didn't get invited much to speak before I lived overseas. So there's some kind of lateral agency in moving to other spaces in order to do research that comes back to places, but also in terms of what I get out of moving around, I do get a lot out of having some kind of comparative sense on what's going on, and I could never have ever done this project if I'd stayed in Australia because it wouldn't be distant enough and it would just be totally ordinary. On the settler colonial artist question, I don't think I'm not a settler colonial artist. I'm just saying that his imagination of the relationship between labour and nature is very much formed by settler colonial conditions, and you can see that in the way that he thinks about labour and industry on the seas and the industrialisation of the ocean. And I really struggle with secular because when I talk about my research, people tell me, oh, you're like the feminist version of Ellen Sekula. And I'm trying to figure out if that's true, but I don't think it's that true because I think why isn't it true? I think that basically divestment politics for me is divestment from what labour politics once was, and that's basically his generation of labour politics as industrial images of subjectivity and particular kinds of let's say European imaginations of factories that get much more complicated outside of European radical film history and yeah, there's a kind of mirror image between the American West and radical essayistic cinema that happens in his practice. And we did a project at the Amber Night called Moving Images of Speculation, where we rewatched all the radical labour filmmakers of the last so many decades. It was a very scholarly project. But through that, I somehow came to realise that he's not talked about as a settler colonial artist, and my reasons why I was struggling to talk about the insufficiency of his film language to what I'm trying to do is precisely because it was too familiar to me. So when I look at his films, I feel like I'm back in my father's retail fishing store, scrubbing the scales off fish and bagging hooks and sinkers, and I have no distance on it whatsoever, but I also think that my sentimentalization of that would lead to just reproducing Ellen Sekula's work, and as a woman, that first of all, it's impossible, but as someone working now around the same different kinds of industrial practices and different kinds of imaginations of material, it would make no political sense to reproduce that work right now, basically.
On this question of using art infrastructure, I completely follow you. I understand that in a very pragmatic sense. It makes sense to me. I still think that there's an aspect of art ontology that I would like to either have teased out more,
oh yeah, no, that's not even talk, yeah,
or discarded.
Yeah.
Because basically, actually, in order to use art infrastructure, you don't really need art ontology. Yeah, at least not at the moment. Yeah. Because it's to talk about real life is so sexy to the art world. It's you don't need to have talk about art. So
yeah. So you can keep it. The art is what I do when I'm not doing this. So the exhibition at vanabbe next year will have weird drawings and, you know, me maybe performing hopefully more weird poetry. But there is a split in me between, you know, what I can manage to communicate through particular kinds of forms, and the artistic work happens late, you know, after I thought I wanted to be a curator, and after I basically I was kind of deconstructed by the mind on some level. So it happened at the same time where I quit curating because I wanted to work more creatively and more politically, because institutional museum curating, where I was very administrative and very demanding, but not in very interesting ways. There's many different kinds of institutions. But I used it as an excuse to do more political research and to let myself be as creative as I wanted to do in relationship to that research. So definitely the art is not in this presentation, but it is in the exhibitions that you'll see that make sense. And it's really, I mean, there is something that, I mean, if I wanted to think more about how I'm relating to art history, I would go and research conceptual drawing practices and the relationship between language and conceptualism that happens more through more ephemeral practice. I mean, I could do that, but it's much more interesting to me to more cleanly split, like when I'm like, okay, I'm being an artist, you guys can be quiet, I'm going over there, I'm going to write poems or do some drawings. And I don't theorize in between that, because it's more fun to leave both sides and do more committed analysis or more totally irresponsible production on stuff that's so important to me, and realize that I'm just a pathetic single person, you know, writing extremely dense words on a page and knowing that I'm allowed to be a poet whenever I want to be. So that, like, yeah, I think that I'm very uninterested in art history in the division of those kinds of layers inside of my practice or something. Yeah. But it's not to say that I don't think it's art, I'm happy for people to think that might be art and that might be analysis or something.
Yeah, I mean, that again makes much sense to me. But I would still insist that there is an ontological aspect that you're referring to, or simply suggesting, and even in this denunciation of Sekula, which I also can follow, is still there, that I think would make more sense to somehow discard. This thing about this being in your father's shed and cleaning, I completely understand this kind of, and I think that the criteria of maybe not fun but inspiration that you're not talking about is absolutely necessary to knowledge production. So that it's not just about what kind of knowledge needs to be produced right now politically, but also what kind of knowledge do I want to produce right now, and what are the tools. So I also completely understand, and I think it's actually a huge paradigm shift between you and Sekula. That has to do with you individually and your political position, but also with the times. What I, on the other hand, find problematic is a kind of need to delegitimize positions.
But I didn't say he's bad. I'm saying
no, but even to say, okay, this was European and it's limited. I understand, but I think that I don't mind this as a personal position, but by claiming this personal position right at this historical moment, you're also tying into a mainstream art discourse on what is okay to do right now and what is not okay anymore.
No, I totally
This is
disagree.
why
I totally disagree. I mean, I feel like there is no artist more relevant to what I'm trying to do than Alan Sekula on some level. I mean, it's literally, even in his references, like the array of his references, if I wanted to do my own research through referencing every single reference that he has in his films, I could produce a work that's completely relevant to every single thing that I presented here. The point is that it's a psychic rejection of a practice that I will waste time emulating if I like him too much. And he will trap me in certain reproductions of like a response to industry that is outdated, because I know it's outdated, because when I watch his work I get annoyed because it's so intimate to me. That's the thing. So I'm not saying, oh, Alan Sekula, let's not watch Alan Sekula anymore. I watched all of Alan Sekula and I'll do it again and again. But he is almost the most relevant artist to this kind of practice. And when I called him a settler colonial artist, I was just saying, for the people that don't know the conditions of settler colonies, that category helps him make sense in terms of what he was trying to do that is also related to what I'm trying to do. So I'm not saying I am something other than that. You get that?
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you all for coming and listening and being willing to be part of this really extraordinary conversation. Thank you.